Hi, everyone. Welcome to This Is CDR. My name is Jared Hunter. I'm filling in for our usual co-host, Toby Bryce. Like everyone at Open Air, I'm a volunteer. I'm based in New York City, where I contribute to our advocacy efforts, community building, and I kind of work behind the scenes to organize This Is CDR. This Is CDR is our online series presented to explore the wide range of carbon dioxide removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and to contextualize them for policy proposals under development for New York State and other jurisdictions. If you don't know about Open Air Collective, we're a distributed volunteer network dedicated to the advancement of carbon dioxide removal solutions, which are essential to solving the climate crisis. Our community collaborates on shared open source missions in the areas of R&D, advocacy, and CDR market development. We'll put some links in the chat where you can follow us on Twitter. And if you want to join Open Air Collective, there'll be a link there too. We have an active Discord server where most of our community meets and shares ideas and develops policy and R&D projects. Everyone here is probably familiar with what CDR is, but we'll just give a little primer here. CDR is a practice of capturing CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it safely for a long period of time in the geosphere, the ocean, or other long-lived products. Of course, it's essential to emphasize that CDR is not in any way an alternative to reducing emissions. We must reduce global emissions and decarbonize our economy as quickly and as completely as possible. That being said, every credible climate forecast, including the most recent IPCC assessment, shows that CDR will be required at gigaton scale, that's billions of tons per year, by mid-century to counteract those emissions that are difficult or inequitable to abate, and ultimately to start removing the tremendous excess of CO2 that's already in the atmosphere, so we can restore our climate to a safer and healthier state. If you're new to CDR, the previous sessions of This Is CDR are a great place to start. We'll put a link to all those recordings in the chat. Of particular interest, we do have some prior episodes that were entirely dedicated to biochar and enhanced weathering with rock dust, so you might want to check those out. And of course, we're here today to learn more. We'll be continuing these sessions weekly on an ongoing basis. More details about that at the end. Just one other note here, background on a bill that we have introduced in the New York State Legislature right now. Our volunteers research and develop policy ideas at the national, state, and local level that will help accelerate CDR. This bill that's very important to us is the Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act, which has been introduced in both chambers of the New York State Legislature. We have members in other states and countries who are also actively working on adapting this framework for their jurisdictions. So in brief, CDRLA is a framework for state governments to become early adopters of CDR and provide market support to scale durable CDR. We have a whole episode in a previous session dedicated to that bill, and so check that out if you want to learn more about it. So now I'll throw things over to my colleague Megha Raghavan, who's going to introduce today's presenter.
All right. Hey, everyone. I'm Megha Raghavan. I'm an Open Air member based out in London, but working on policy opportunities in California, where I'm from. So our usual housekeeping notes, our format is going to be a 15 to 20-minute presentation, followed by a few prepared questions, and then moderated audience Q&A. So please put any questions you have into the Zoom Q&A box as we go along. Note that that's separate from the chat function, so make sure you put it in the one labeled Q&A. The event is being recorded, so we'll send the video link out to everyone who registered, and we'll also post it to Open Air's website and our YouTube channel. This week, we're very happy to welcome Peter Olivier of the Future Forest Company. Peter joined the Future Forest Company in April 2021 and helped to spin up their US operations. He currently leads the innovation team there. And prior to joining the Future Forest Company, Peter consulted for Wally Farms, a climate resilience and adaptation project in the Hudson Valley, and wrote a newsletter on biochar called The Burning Question. We are also hoping that Jim Mann, the co-founder and CEO of the Future Forest Company, will be with us before too long to answer some questions. And just as some background on Jim, he grew up on a hill farm before studying ecology at Durham University. After university, he founded several successful businesses in technology, retail, and leisure before his environmental background drew him back to the fight against climate change and the ecological disaster it's bringing with it. The Future Forest Company was born with the aim to deliver large-scale reforestation projects of degraded land in the UK to have a meaningful impact in the future, the fight against climate change. And when he's not in the forest, Jim runs competitively at ultra distances, his favorite events being 100-plus-mile mountain races. So Peter, over to you for your presentation.
Thanks so much. All right. Well, thanks so much. I will. I'm standing in here today for Jim, who is, if I have things sorted out right, he's currently at Heathrow Airport, so we'll spare you that background. But he will be joining us a little bit later on the call. So please do. We look forward to your questions. So first, couple things. So I'm the head of innovation here at the Future Forest Company, and I'm based in Hudson, New York. So your policy work and particular the CDR LA is something of personal interest to me. Really excited about that. And so thanks to you all in the open air community for pushing forward on that. It's very exciting. So I want to talk a little bit about the Future Forest Company. I think while I know the community knows a lot about enhanced rock weathering and biochar, we are going to cover those things. So first, I want to talk a little bit about the founding of the company, the origin of the company, but just to provide some context for the people who don't know the Future Forest Company yet. Our core work is co-deployment of 3 land-based negative emissions technologies. So primarily reforestation, biochar, and enhanced rock weathering. We also buy land and work with landowners to sequester carbon and generate carbon credits. And it's really core to what we're doing. While we see ourselves as a negative emissions technology company, the biodiversity, the co-benefits that come with negative emissions, and particularly our strategies of negative emissions, are really important to us. Jim was an ecologist, and so our focus on negative emissions exists within the context of our interest in biodiversity, habitat loss, general ecosystem, kind of creating thriving ecosystems. So why don't we jump in? Our story starts in Scotland. The company is based there. Jim and most of the team is in the UK, and really was focused on the idea of understanding how to do profitable reforestation. So after kind of running through some cycles there and getting to a place where the model was around profitable reforestation was working, Jim and the team started digging deeper on permanence and came to the conclusion that I'm sure many people in this community have come to, which is that while we need to take care of our ecosystems, we need to reforest, we need to help restore and regenerate a lot of the land that we have been living and working on. We are going to need a lot more permanent and scalable, durable carbon sequestration strategies. And so, taking the initial reforestation work and thinking, how do you build on that strategy? It's essentially accelerating a natural process of carbon capture and storage. So particularly around the idea of seeking gigaton scale solutions that we can use to limit land change. Obviously, we would need plant several globes worth of trees to store all the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So how do we understand those pieces and get to the place where we have scalable strategies that are also holistic and provide us ways of regenerating the earth. So particularly, the ones we ended up focused on are biochar and enhanced rock weathering. And I think starting with biochar, initially the work around forestry led itself very obviously to biochar, and so we'll start there. But I think one thing that it's worth kind of making mention of is that plants are doing the work of capturing carbon dioxide all the time. Wildfires are a natural process by which an enormous amount of carbon is released, but actually some carbon is sequestered. So the idea of making biochar is not strictly kind of a chemical or mechanical process. It's totally a natural process. And about 250 million tons of carbon are stored annually in the form of biochar from wildfires. So this is an enormous amount of carbon. And obviously that doesn't mean that wildfires are a good thing, but it means that the natural process of making biochar or making charcoal is both quite scalable, very natural, and very much part of the way the world currently works. So to give you an idea of the prevalence of pyrogenic carbon worldwide, you can see here on this map something like about 13% of soil organic carbon is made up of pyrogenic carbon, or carbon that was made by fire. And you can see here that some of the areas in which you see the highest levels of pyrogenic carbon are also overlap with very, very rich soils, often soils that took place on grasslands. So you can see Ukraine and central Russia. You can see the Great American grain belt, a lot of other areas in which those kinds of things really, really make a difference to the soil themselves. They also, of course, capture carbon. The process, that we use is obviously not wildfires. We use pyrolysis to make biochar. We use field waste and forestry waste in a pyrolyzer, so a conventional pyrolyzer that you can see kind of detailed here. You have to dry, grind up, and then process the wood. The outputs that you get from it are biochar, which you've probably heard about from Kathleen Draper, but is basically a dense form of carbon. Looks a lot like charcoal, and it's durable. It's recalcitrant. So we have lots of evidence that it's durable on the hundreds to thousands of years timeline. Then additionally, you have biogas or syngas. This is traditionally used to power the process. So the process of pyrolyzing waste, ag waste, forestry waste, is exothermic. So it generates heat, and the way it generates heat is by using that syngas to power the process. In addition, you generate bio-oil. This is what charm is injecting. So it's a thick, viscous oil that is high in carbon and can be used to sequester carbon. And of course, there's excess power in this process. So traditionally, heat and electricity, low-grade heat, but still a relatively large amount of heat and electricity can be created. You see these often tied into community heating projects in Central Europe, Northern Europe. So we're working on we're basically scaling out the production of biochar, and biochar has this is quite recalcitrant, and it's low to negative cost. I think a lot has been made of biochar as a potential soil amendment and other things that you can do with it, but the combination of the value that you can derive from its externalities in soil and the value of the carbon creates a situation in which you can do this scalably, and you can do it scalably at to a relatively high extent. So the annual generation of global biomass waste is on the order of 10 to 20 megatons. 10 to 20 gigatons. And because you can sell it as a product and beneficial to the soil, we think this is a really scalable way to go from, creating forests and creating habitats to generating longer term carbon stores. So the second strategy that we pursue is rock weathering, and this is a natural key element of the global carbon cycle. So about a gigaton of carbon is stored every year naturally. The way that rock weathering happens is carbon dioxide dissolves in rainwater, forming a weak carbonic acid. Then when it hits basic rock, the chemical reaction forms carbonate minerals, which then are dissolved into water and can either form stable carbon in the soil in the form of soil inorganic carbon, or the vast majority of it travels down to the ocean and precipitates out in the form of eventually as kind of limestone, or is converted into shells of little wonderful little. They're usually like shells, basically. And I forget the word for the calciline process that happens there. But in any case, we speed up the basalt rock process, a weathering process, by crushing basalt rock into dust, and we spread it on land, right? So we take this basic rock, particularly what we use is basalt. We put it through a standard crushing process. So all over the world. Aggregate companies produce relatively fine grain rock for various commercial processes. So we use those to create a very fine dust, or at least about sand and down. And then we put it on land. We wait for the rain to fall, which on our initial work in Scotland, you don't have to wait very, very long for that to happen. And carbonate minerals come out of that process and are then stored on very, very long timescales. So enhanced rock weathering is wonderful because it's both a natural process to sequester CO2, but it, relative to human timescales, is permanent. So 100,000 to million years timescale. And because we're accelerating a natural process, although we need to modify the rock, there's no kind of significant technological inputs here to the creation of the carbon sequestration. And as a consequence, it can be scaled up very significantly. And the IPCC thinks we're talking gigaton plus solutions here, which is wonderful because it can be deployed very widely and it can use existing infrastructure for both extraction and distribution. Now, obviously, most of the world is water, but 2/3 of the land surface on Earth, so that means croplands and pasture lands and forestry lands, could play a part in drawing down carbon. So we are actively doing work around the forestry side of this, and then we're piloting some work to work with agricultural in agricultural environments as well. We also think about the core science that we're pushing forward here will, we hope, enable some of or at least contribute to the understanding of how ocean or ocean-based weathering might happen. So we're very excited and support that work as well. So beyond the carbon side of things, there's an enormous amount of good that can be done by this co-deployment, right? So planting trees, putting down enhanced rock weathering, and putting down biochar alongside crops or trees can really go a long way to improving both CDR, but also these other the state of our soil and the mineralization of our soil is both kind of major problems that we're facing and have been brought into clear focus by the war in Ukraine. So both, I would say, there's kind of historical work here. People since the you can see there 1894 have been thinking about how to use crushed rock to improve their soils. So as part of the dissolution process of rock, not only does the rock, or in this case, basalt, create carbonate minerals, it also releases the other pieces of the basalt rock, other mineral components in basalt rock that include both macro and micronutrients. So usually some phosphorus, some potassium, and then a wide variety of things like selenium, copper, zinc, etc., that are put down and form an important part of plant growth. So this has been used for quite a long time in Brazil. Since the 1970s, people have been looking at this quite extensively. And recently, people are starting to look at this idea of putting down enhanced rock weathering in places specifically to drive plant growth. And you see this both at an academic kind of peer-reviewed level with leaders like David Bierling, and also in kind of policy and practical side, the USDA is starting to look at how we might do this more effectively and scale this up. So the way that enhanced rock weathering helps restore soils is when you have highly mineralized soils or places where there are, for example, exhausted agricultural soils that are devoid of minerals, because after year after year take crop after crop off of them, they can end up being deficient in a lot of these things. We can really start restoring soils with these with the basalt rock that we put down. And in addition, we hope to get to the place where we can start alleviating, or at least understanding how we might alleviate some of the demand that we have for fertilizers. So getting to a place where I'm sure you all know, but fertilizer prices have gone up about 3x over the course of the last 2 months, and have gone up a lot since last year. So understanding how we're going to provide the minerals that farmers need is something that is very important to us, and I think a key piece of scaling up our work. But not just biochar, not just enhanced weathering. Biochar also creates a really potential, like a lot of potential ways that it can help the soil, because biochar is has a lot of surface area. If you were to take a gram of biochar and spread it out flat, it would have the surface area of about a tennis court. So that type environment fosters the growth of the soil microbiome. Both fungal and bacterial communities tend to really like biochar. And that's really helpful when you're trying to foster life. In addition, that high surface area allows biochar to capture fertilizer. We all know that nitrogen fertilizers, we can put them down, but a lot of them run off into our water systems, which causes a lot of different problems. Biochar, because of that kind of sticky surface area, can create a situation in which that retention lasts longer and makes it more bioavailable to plants, right? They can access it for a longer period of time. And so with enhanced rock weathering, we've seen yields improve. Same thing with biochar. But getting to a place really where we're proving this at kind of major kind of landscape scale trials, and getting to a place where we're producing that kind of data is very exciting, and would allow us to look more closely at some other benefits like water retention, increased cation exchange, some pH buffering, and potentially, even using biochar as a replacement for things like peat in soil grow media. So then, combining these two things is something that we're really excited about. We're working with the Carbon Community, which is a group that's based in the UK, to do some kind of scientific approaches to the combination of both biochar and enhanced rock weathering in tree planting environments. So we're really excited about getting started on that. We think that there's a high potential for these things to really work together. So I'll leave it there, and we'll see if maybe we can get Jim on the line. But until then, I'm happy to take as many questions as you guys want to toss my way.
Great. Thanks for that, Peter. It looks like we may have Jim here.
Hey, how you doing? Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Great. So apologies, I'm in an airport, so there might be a bit of background noise.
No problem. We'll make the best of it. So maybe first, thanks for that great presentation, Peter. It's really interesting to see how you guys are planning to coordinate all these different pathways together and how they sort of reinforce and support each other. I guess maybe we'll move on to some of the pre-prepared questions, and I'll leave it to you, Jim and Peter, as to maybe who wants to field each question. I guess the first question we normally ask our panelists is, how you got to where you are now, your personal journey professionally, and your interest in, working on climate change solutions.
Yeah, I'll pick that up. So I guess I've been aware for a long while. Studying ecology at university, I was aware that climate change was a big problem, but I kind of thought it was probably somebody else's problem, as I think a lot of us do. So I deferred to governments who I felt would fix this problem, and went off and built businesses. And it's then coming back after 15, 20 years of watching governments in action and starting to understand why governments are actually ill-equipped to fix the problem, that I decided to start working more actively on the problem. And then it's a journey of tree planting, which is obvious for biodiversity plus carbon. There's all sorts of co-benefits there. But once you realize that that just can't scale enough, you know, it sent me down a path of what else can scale, but also is holistic. What else is benefiting the ecosystem? I'm not really drawn to the engineered solutions because of the lack of co-benefits. They're important, we need them. And then also you look at the nature-based solutions and how vulnerable they are at, say, 2 degrees of warming. And that's where we sort of landed in this in-between area where you take a natural process and you look at how you accelerate it to get to gigaton benefit. And it feels to me like the fastest ways to gigaton removal are in this middle ground, this sort of holistic ground that we look at.
Thanks. That's a great answer. That there was a question I wanted to ask you, which you just sort of set up there with, you know, as the effects of climate change get worse, those risks to forests are only going to increase, whether it's wildfires, drought, flooding, other severe weather, and pests. So what, you know, how does your combined efforts sort of protect your sites from these types of risks, if at all? Is that possible?
So it doesn't. I mean, what we started with was a thesis that if we chose the right location, we could do this. So we mainly plant on the west coast of Scotland. It's a very wet environment. We're very well insulated from forest fires. At 2 degrees of warming, whichever scenario you play out, it's likely that forests will survive. The problem with scaling up reforestation or afforestation is that there aren't that many places on the planet that are going to be protected at 2 degrees of warming. And that's why we are focusing more and more on decoupling these solutions that work very well together and actually working with agricultural holdings where we can place either enhanced rock weathering or biochar or a combination of the two, and they still have ecosystem benefits. But reforestation is less of a focus for us now. We're very much deprioritizing that because I have real concerns about how that scales. And you look at the buffers being eaten away in things like the Californian trading system, where it's predominantly forest based. We've got a lot of serious problems with nature-based solutions, I think, to come.
That's really interesting. I was going to ask a little bit about the sort of balance between the different approaches you're taking. So you just sort of answered that, but I was going to ask how the spread between these different approaches will net out. Sorry, I'm bungling this question, but can you just kind of break down your expectations by sector for the carbon sequestration? I mean, biochar, enhanced weathering, forestation.
Yeah, so reforestation will try and facilitate more reforestation, but it will be the lowest actual carbon removal, I think, of the three. Enhanced rock weathering and biochar are both potentially gigaton solutions. And that's how we try and think in the organization. So there's little point in thinking less than megaton so less than 1 million tons of carbon removal on any solution in my opinion. If you can't get it to 1 million tons, it's probably not of real value in terms of carbon removal. What we try to think in terms of and what we talk about within the organization is how do we get this to billion ton removal? How do we get this to gigaton? And that's sort of our North Star. We think that on both enhanced rock weathering and biochar, gigaton, billion ton removal is possible. And in terms of pace, we think that enhanced rock weathering will grow fastest initially, but biochar can also get to that scale.
Great. Here's a technical question for you. In one of our past sessions, we had a researcher from Cornell, Dr. Boudinot, who studies enhanced weathering. And he spoke to us about sort of the difficulties in his research of recording or measuring the performance of enhanced weathering because of all the very, variety in soil characteristics and also just technically with the lysimeters they were deploying to try and do their research. And I think that's sort of an issue with biochar too. It's a little bit hard to, if I understand correctly, to really know the performance you're getting. How do you plan to measure and report the deployments of biochar and enhanced weathering? And also, just sort of follow-up question, are there carbon offset protocols yet for biochar?
Yeah, I'll defer to Pete on the biochar, but on the enhanced rock weathering, because Pete spent a huge amount of time in biochar. On the enhanced rock weathering, it is difficult to measure. That's the key challenge with it. There aren't currently protocols. So the approach we have taken is we've developed what is the most advanced, we believe, model for enhanced rock weathering on the planet, working with leading scientists. And that takes in factors like the particle size distribution. So not just the sort of maximum particle of material we're putting down, but all the range of particles and how many of each size are in that set. So we can look at the surface area to volume ratio of an application. It takes into account the soil type, soil conditions. It takes into account the chemistry and the mineralogy of the rock. And it takes into account all the environmental conditions in the location where you're spreading it. So the level of precipitation, the temperature. And that means you can model with a good degree of accuracy. And then we have various ways of informing that model. So we use lysimeters. We don't think they're going to be the best way of doing this long term. We're working with various electronic sensors and also using some pretty cutting edge technology, where we're looking at using effectively radiation to measure what's actually happening in the ground on a regular basis. So they will inform the model and allow us to improve the model through that measuring approach. Do you want to talk about the biochar, Pete?
Yeah, sure. I think thankfully from an MRV standpoint, the biochar kind of pathway is more straightforward. It's a metered process, and that you can measure what's going in and what's coming out. So in that sense, it's more straightforward from an MRV process. Obviously, the concern with biochar is always that the feedstock is coming from sustainable forests or waste streams. You don't want situations in which people are cutting down forests to make biochar. So I think that is more of an operational challenge as opposed to a monitoring and evaluation challenge. But I mean, I think it's nonetheless important. I do think that the primary challenge around biochar is not the quantification; it's the achievement of scale.
On another sort of just curiosity for at the operational level, maybe I'm sort of want to understand, or maybe you could draw us a picture of like what one of your sites is going to look like and how it will look over time. I know you're talking about reforesting degraded land and applying these, sort of agricultural type amendments. And you mentioned that there is infrastructure in place, obviously, in an agricultural setting for spreading soil amendments around. That infrastructure exists, but it doesn't really exist in a forest setting right now that I know of. Are you planning on these sites really turning into a dense natural type of forest, which will have soil amendments added to it, or are these going to be more open fields? So can you just tell us a little bit more about sort of how it's going to work and how it's going to play out over the next decades?
Sure. So at this stage, you're right. Spreading in forested land is really hard. We have done some work there to look at how that might change over time. Where you make applications prior to planting, that's much easier because you're often taking a site that's clear. And this is partly why we've decoupled the operations so that we can do them on different land. If you look at agricultural or grazing land, you'll see very little change to that land. You'll see improved soil health. But in terms of looking at it from the roadside, you'll see very little difference when we're applying biochar and enhanced rock weathering. And we can use existing infrastructure for those applications.
Oh, I see. So when you're talking about decoupling, you mean physically decoupling your sites?
Absolutely.
I
Yes.
see.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
And we're working more and more with partners for that. So there's tens of thousands of tons of basalt now being spread in Scotland, and we're working with farmers on that process. So looking at how we get to scale quicker, and partnering with them to do that.
Great. I'm just going to ask you one last question that I feel is important to ask everyone who comes on the show, and then we'll turn it over to the audience Q&A. But with any sort of CDR or climate change solution, it's important to ask about the topic of environmental justice. Could you just frame for a minute your mission in terms of the EJ principles of promoting a fair and equitable distribution of benefits and burdens to the environment, either at a local, global, national level, however you see it?
Yeah, I think we're bringing stakeholders into what we're doing, and I think that's really important, particularly when we start looking at the global south. And it's not somewhere we're working yet, but as we develop the models and we develop the technology platform that runs underneath all of this, we're able to work with smallholder farmers, and there is a project we're actively pursuing in Africa, where hopefully we'll be working with smallholder farmers and empowering them to not only improve the soil, but do that without cost, and also help in the climate fight. And obviously, one of the big problems with climate justice is those that have done the most pollution are the least likely to be impacted severely by climate change. And so allowing and trying to help the global south be involved in the solutions, but also profit from those solutions, I think is a really important element of what we're doing.
Well put. I'm going to turn things over to Mega now to hear some of our audience questions. Thanks so much, Jim and Peter.
Hey, thanks, guys. Yeah, so we have a bunch of questions coming in. I think the first one, which is always something people tend to ask, is what kind of biodiversity co-benefits have you observed in your work so far? And are you working with any rewilding movements or other kind of adjacent areas?
It's pretty early to really tell. Obviously, when you do reforestation, you see immediate biodiversity benefits. Where we're sort of working with agricultural holdings, it'll take longer for us to see those results, and they're more likely to be an upward trophic cascade. So starting with bacteria and fungi in the soil, and that developing then through the insect life and up the chain. And it depends a little bit on the farming practice that's continued to be employed. A lot of the farmers that are adopting this early doors with us are already sort of thinking regeneratively, so probably have pretty positive systems which aren't killing off the wildlife. And this gives them another tool. So it means less applications of some of the fertilizers that they would apply, which are pretty toxic for soil biology. So hopefully by bringing natural solutions, we'll see that, but it'll be a while before we can measure that. And it's more likely at the microscopic level.
Okay. And then on the flip side, if you've done any environmental impact studies from the crushed basalt dispersal and the ERW technique, are there any, findings from that, any adverse impacts or just kind of things you've learned out of those studies?
Nothing so far. We are monitoring for that. We're particularly conscious of that as we move towards landscape scale. And that's why we're doing these very large scale trials where there's tens of thousands of tons and ultimately hundreds of thousands of tons. We need to understand what happens with a good scientific basis underpinning that. And we're sort of going to that scale. We're now ahead of the science and working with scientists to make sure we monitor it and can inform on what happens. We don't expect any negative impacts, but we are monitoring for it.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth mentioning that we are very rigorous around the very obvious challenges that crop up in the field, things like metals in the rock that you could use and things like that. We take that extremely seriously. We don't spread rock without doing rigorous testing of both the soil that we're spreading on and the rock that we're spreading. So yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and to add to that, that's the reason that we've steered away from olivine at this stage. Olivine's had a lot of hype because it's very, very good as a carbon removal rock, but it's often associated with heavy metals, in particular nickel. And until we really understand what happens with that nickel once it's on the ground and other associated heavy metals, we view it as high risk. It also doesn't bring the same co-benefits because it's a much narrower spectrum of minerals. There's a lot of magnesium there, and that could potentially be a problem as well. So we're just being very careful, and that's why we've used basalt, which has been used for hundreds of years in some farming settings.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess it kind of ties in well to the next question, which is, basalt is not necessarily common everywhere. So is this kind of limited in scope by the availability of basalt? Or do you see that as a problem as when you think about scaling up?
Yeah, I mean, it could be a limit in some areas, but basalt is a wide range of rocks and is one of the most abundant materials on the planet. So in a lot of cases, the proximity isn't a problem, and there will be a source of basalt available in a reasonably local situation. Okay,
yeah. And then in terms of the deployment as well, when you think about, appropriate areas, I guess being near a basalt quarry or somewhere you can get basalt is one consideration. Someone asked a question of, is the deployment area limited by weather conditions? So, are you worried about specific weather patterns in areas that might distribute the dust where it's not intended, or is that a factor in kind of the right location to deploy this kind of solution?
Sure, we think about that in terms of, but it's more in terms of weathering rate than anything else. So warmer and wetter conditions are preferable for faster weathering rates. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do this in other areas where it's slower. Just because it's slower doesn't mean you don't get the benefits. You commercially, it's maybe more challenging. But that doesn't exclude those areas. The areas where we would be more careful are things like nature areas where you want a depleted soil. So some natural systems are actually quite depleted, and if you go and add nutrients there, you're not necessarily doing something positive. Very different to croplands. Where you want more nutrition because you're stripping nutrition out of there on an annual basis.
Got it. Makes sense. When thinking about the energy side of things, so like obviously crushing and mining the rock takes some amount of energy. Can you talk a little bit about how that kind of factors into the calculations? What is the sort of scale of energy required versus the carbon removal potential and how that balances out?
Yeah, I mean, so where we can find waste material that takes less energy, obviously that's beneficial. And we do life cycle analysis on everything to ensure that we've got a net carbon benefit. And actually, the rock extraction isn't typically too bad, nor is the transportation. It's the grinding of the rock that tends to be the largest energy consumer, but still we're in a positive net carbon removal situation with it.
I would add that the standard crushing equipment is all run they're all electric machines. They tend to be run on generators at this point, and even using a generator, you end up with of the carbon that is sequestered in the process, something under 10% of it is used in the production of the rock. So it doesn't represent a huge portion of the LCA. And there's also relatively straightforward path to go from using generators to using grid power, which can be renewable.
Got it. We got one quite specific question on the feedstock. So someone asked, can you comment on the effectiveness of unaltered versus metamorphic basalt as a feedstock for your weathering process?
So you're getting beyond my geological knowledge here. And what we do, I can talk about our process, which hopefully will inform on this. So when we sample rock, we will measure both the chemistry and the mineralogy. So the chemistry, if you think about it as the elements that are held within that rock, the mineralogy is effectively how they are held together. And all of that is then informed in our model as to how fast they're going to be released in the certain conditions in that location. So we would be able to work with both. They would have different properties, and we would pick that up in our modeling.
Got
I
it.
think that answers the question. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah. Another sort of slightly technical question was how does future forest avoid the risk of CO2 emissions from amended soil as a result of any kind of re-acidification that might happen by natural processes, if such processes exist?
Sorry, could you just repeat that question for me?
Yeah. So the question was, how does future forests avoid any risk of CO2 emissions from amended soil as a result of re-acidification by natural processes, if any such process exists?
So I'm not aware. I'm not sure what process they're referring to here. So
I think the question is more like, is that possible? Is there such a process that might lead to that?
So we watch out for things like nitrogen fertilizers. We're aware that nitric acid could have some impact. We're trying to get a decent measure on that at the moment. Other than that, we typically, as long as the land use is maintained, most of your you shouldn't get a reversal. No, it's quite hard to get a reversal because this is once this chemistry has happened, it's hard, a lot of energy to reverse it. And a huge amount, the vast majority of this actually leaves the soil as bicarbonate ions and heads down to the oceans. So it's not within the soil that you'd be reversing, it's within the oceans, and in the oceans it's very, very hard to reverse.
Okay.
I think it's worth mentioning that that the alkalinity, one of the major, we have both a carbon dioxide problem and an ocean acidification problem. And one of the benefits of doing this work is that the alkalinity that is generated in soils can maintain, some of it can be retained in soils, but much of it will end up in the ocean, where it has an additional pH buffering effect, which is positive.
Yep. Got it. No, I think that answers the question. And then I know you talked about, we had a few questions on MRV, which I think you guys have already addressed, but one that maybe is a little more specific is, can you expand on your testing plan and what could replace lysimeters?
Yeah, I mean, the obvious one is electronic probes, and we're working on some electronic probe technology at the moment that hopefully will come to fruition. That's the sort of like-for-like replacement, if you like. There are other techniques which I touched on briefly that we're exploring, which hopefully will give us more detailed chemistry and mineralogy in the soil itself, and allow us to take regular snapshots to see exactly what's happening. And we're developing those. We'll see how those progress as well.
Okay. We had a bunch of questions about sort of the business side of things, which I'm going to move to now. So first of all, could you just talk about maybe recap which countries you're already in and which other countries you might be considering in the future?
So we think of ourselves as a global company. So ultimately, we'd like to be working all over the world. Currently, we're working in the UK and the US. There are main focuses there where we're building out the team at the moment, and where we sort of deeply understand the market. We have opportunities on pretty much every continent, where we're talking to potential stakeholders about expanding there. So we're currently in the process of fundraising, and then we'll start to expand much more rapidly across the globe, hopefully.
Got it. And what kind of business model do you guys, either now or sort of plan to set up for your business in the future?
So we embrace working with partners, but that can take several different forms. Typically, we are buying rock and then spreading it at the moment, but we're exploring partnerships with some of the rock owners at the moment.
Okay. And then just thinking about pricing, I think we hear different numbers as to what kind of prices might be expected in carbon removal markets, sort of at scale. What kind of prices do you expect, if that you would be able to provide carbon removal at as this technology scales up?
So I think one of the things that's going to have a huge impact on this is what are the co-benefits. Once we can measure the fertilizer benefits, clearly there's a cost saving there. and we're trying to track that at the moment. That will have a huge impact on price. I think we will be able to get this down to about $100 a ton in due course, but there's quite a long way for it to come down that cost curve.
Yeah. And as you're working on this today, what have you observed so far on the social acceptance of CDR work? Do you face challenges on that front? Are people excited about it?
Who do you mean by people? Do you mean the farmers or?
Yeah, great question. I guess, I mean, everyone from, investors, the farmers, people in policy, for example, anyone that you've kind of encountered as you take this forward.
So I think the farmers are initially skeptical, but then once we have the opportunity to really deeply explain it to them and they see the peers working with us, they rapidly come round a lot quicker than we anticipated. They might come round to what we're doing. In terms of policy, well, it just can't move quick enough. We need policy to move dramatically and really fast. I think there's still a problem with people understanding that we have to have removals. I mean, it's not this isn't an either or. We must decarbonise, and I'm fully behind that, and would encourage businesses to decarbonise whatever they can first. But as a society, we are going to need carbon removal, and that's going to be absolutely essential. So we need to get those technologies to a point where they're ready to scale, because it'll become absolutely abundantly clear over the next few years, I think, just how bad this is, and people will then want where are the solutions? How do we scale them quickly? Well, we need to have those solutions ready that can be scaled quickly. So I think that makes it really important with investors. We've seen a massive switch with investors. From even a year ago, having to explain to them why carbon removals are essential, to being able to say to them today, sort of a slide about why carbon removals are important, and almost have them say, okay, we get this, don't worry, move on. And even the mainstream investors. So I've been talking to tier one, what I would class as generalist VCs this week, a whole series of meetings with them, and they all get it. They all understand that now. So the CDR community has done a fantastic job of communicating that to investors, which is really promising.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Just one last question before I hand it back to Jared to close this out. You talked a little bit about policy. What kind of policies do you think are going to be the most crucial, either in terms of sort of the structure or anything else, to get businesses like yours going and get them to scale? So
we'd love to see carbon being taxed appropriately, because it's a pollution and we should be taxing it. But I think that's a long way off. I think transparency is the most important thing that we need to push for immediately, where all organisations should be reporting on it. It comes back to that classic startup cliche of, if you're not measuring it, you're not tracking it, you can't respond to it. And I think it's a relatively small ask for all businesses to have to track their carbon footprint. And I think once they start tracking that, and public companies certainly should have to publish it, and then we can see who's doing the pollution and who's on their way to actually meeting the climate obligations that they have set out.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you guys so much. Both of you, and Jim especially, thank you for joining in the midst of your travel journey. This has been great.
No problem. Sorry I couldn't be here at the start. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Thank you both so much.
Thanks so
Jared,
much.
I'll just hand it back to you.
Great. Thanks so much. Yeah, and we really appreciate you fitting this in. Next week, we will be having Dr. Peter Kellerman from Columbia University, and that, I believe, is at a special time at 2 p.m., followed by Verdox the next week, and Takachar. So thanks again, everyone, for coming. Please follow us on Twitter, or follow the links in the chat to join Open Air Collective. Thank you again, Peter and Jim, and we'll leave the Zoom chat up for a few minutes just in case anyone wants to get any of those links. And otherwise, we'll see you all next week. Thanks very much.